Welcome one, welcome all, to the most recent episode of The Global and the Granite State, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We appreciate your interest in these global conversations and hope you will continue to engage in our various discussions. In a time where the world is changing rapidly and people can feel overwhelmed, it is important to find ways to remain engaged and push the conversation forward. If this is your first time listening, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to engage communities in global conversations. As a community-supported organization, your engagement is vital to our continued success in this long-term work, and we thank our members and donors for the ways they make this worthwhile. A special thank you to McLean Middleton for their ongoing support of the Global and the Granite State. Your leadership allows us to bring together our global community, expanding our impact and fostering a deeper understanding of the critical issues facing the world, highlighting how history informs today. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 115 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. Okay, on with the show. May indicate that humans are becoming more compassionate and less brutal, there is no shortage of examples where that has not been the case. More recently, it can seem like human nature is returning to a brutal and aggressive stance, and that the worst of our instincts are being empowered. Even though laws remain in place to constrain these tendencies, it seems like fewer global leaders are held accountable when they cross the line. It remains true that the more powerful the country, the less likely they are going to be brought to justice. And now, even leaders of small countries, such as Sudan, are committing atrocities at high rates, and the world seems not to care. In fact, leaders of major countries are calling for governments to not, quote-unquote, lecture others on their internal dealings. This is not meant to discourage the average listener, but rather to set the stage and to remind people that while justice is not always swift, it can come in unlikely forms.
Well, obviously, people know about Nuremberg, they know about the Holocaust, they know about the genocide against the Armenians, and then a number of atrocities that have happened in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, other places around the world. And of course, there's a new focus on it by the West and the international community generally in terms of preventing atrocities and then holding people accountable for atrocities.
That is Chris Ried, Director of Operations at Mercury SGS and the former Regime War Crimes Liaison in post-Saddam Hussein, Iraq. As we approach several different anniversaries in reference to the capture, trial, and execution of Saddam, we spoke with Chris to explore his insights and experiences, pulling forward the lessons we can learn for today. As atrocities are on the rise and claims of genocide abound, it is an important time to understand the challenges and successes of holding people accountable for the worst deprivations in human history.
In the Saddam's case, some signs that maybe there was some influence of these international tribunals. So deterrence is an important role of these tribunals. Truth-seeking, making sure that there's a record of what happened, because oftentimes, as you've seen in the Armenian genocide case, but also in the case of World War II, Eisenhower wrote a note about going to one of the concentration camps, having the soldiers and the press go to the concentration camps, because even during the war, people were denying what was going on. And he predicted that if a record wasn't made of it, that people would deny it. And so now we do have people who deny it, but we have a record. We have a historical record. People can look at the transcripts, they can look at the films, and they can say, here is what happened, and have a good idea of what the truth of it was. The other one is justice for the victims. Victims want justice, and this is part of the peace building part of these trials. You want to, after there's atrocities, you want the people to come together, and usually if there's an atrocity, there's some real tensions there. So we have different ways of dealing with it. In South Africa, they did a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In other places, they do trials. And there's another option as well, which is sometimes they say, we want to stop this war, we want to stop this fighting, we're going to send the dictator away. And that's the kind of peace versus justice thing. But certainly having a fair trial and having a trial that everyone can look at and say, okay, we now have a shared understanding of what happened and justice was done, helps with reconciliation.
These are all very difficult things to balance. Do you want to get to the heart of the matter? Let people know what happened to their loved ones who just disappeared one day? Let them know what really happened when the army rolled through? Let people know why their town, community, or ethnic groups were targeted? Or does the justice and accountability become the most important thing? Do you want to set the precedent for the future that you cannot just get away with committing atrocities? Or do we simply want to end the killing at all costs? There are no easy answers, and whatever path you choose will not be 100% without trade-offs.
Frankly, when you're dealing with this kind of an issue, whatever you do is going to be wrong on some level. Whatever you do, there's going to be some serious negative consequences to it. And it's hard to say what would have happened if you did it the other way. You just know what some of the potential consequences were, and you try to mitigate and avoid them.
One issue around bringing leaders to account is the challenge that you cannot simply go into a country, arrest its leader, and drag them in front of an international tribunal. You similarly can rarely count on a country to hold their leader accountable, at least while they still hold power. Look at the case of Omar al-Bashir from Sudan. As dictator, he committed several atrocities against his own people in the name of fighting an insurgency, and was accused of leading a genocide against the people of Darfur in 2009. While there are many twists and turns to the story, it only ends with him being overthrown by his people and being placed in jail. But only on the charges of corruption, not genocide, war crimes, or human rights violations.
There's a question that comes up about whether these should be done as international tribunals or as local tribunals. And even the International Criminal Court under the Rome Statute has this part of it called complementarity. So if a country that is part of the Rome Statute, is part of the ICC, is willing to and can try the perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, other atrocities, then that is the first choice. Otherwise, it can go to the International Tribunal. And so there's a lot of talk about which does the job better. Obviously, if you do it locally, sometimes they don't have the same standards of due process. The international community doesn't like it when there's the death penalty, whereas in a lot of countries there is the death penalty.
These are not easy decisions, and whenever possible should be left to the people of the country to make, in a way that ensures accountability and justice.
You have to balance those things. And I can talk about the Iraq example in particular. The Iraqis really wanted to have the trial locally. They did not want it to be seen as a kind of victor's justice or an outsider's justice. They wanted to be able to see it as their own justice. Second, one of the problems with the international tribunals is that they take a long, long time. And for the Iraqis, having Saddam sitting there, will he escape? Will somebody strike a deal with him? Will he come back? That was a problem for them. They wanted to put some finality to the thing. But also, they didn't think it was fair that Saddam and Ali Hussein al-Majid al-Shakriti and Saddam's brothers and some of the others would get this super due process, this lower penalty. And then all the people that they ordered to commit these atrocities, lieutenant who killed the person, killing one person as part of a genocide is the crime of genocide. Those people would not get the same level of due process, and they would get the death penalty in some cases. And so they didn't think that that was fair. So that was another reason why they wanted to do it local. Secondly, they just wanted people in Iraq to see it happening and understand what happened. And if there was anything that we did that was positive, was we showed the Iraqi people a trial that tried to have due process, and they'd never seen it before. They hadn't seen the trials during Saddam, and certainly those were not due process. Saddam could just decide, hey, judge, take this guy out and shoot him, or he could just take him out and shoot him without going to a judge.
I will add here a bit of a graphic story, where in 1982, the Minister for Health at the time, Riyad Ibrahim, suggested that Saddam should step down from the presidency at a low point in the Iran-Iraq war. with the understanding that he would resume his role as president at a more favorable time. Saddam reportedly had the minister immediately carted off, and pieces of his body were delivered to his widow the next day. I add this to highlight that no one was safe during the rule of Saddam Hussein. Even his top-level ministers could meet an untimely fate at the hands of this brutal dictator. However, as can be the case in many dictatorships around the world, many of them work to bring the judicial system under their control and to install loyalists at the top judicial positions. There may be some who are simply doing their job and trying to do their best in tough circumstances, but it can be difficult to decipher the good from the bad for a local trial.
There's another issue involved in impartiality that you see in this case as well. But let's just talk about, in the United States, you might have a mass shooting. There's not going to be a single judge in the United States that doesn't have a feeling about that. You're going to have events like 9/11 or the Olympic bombing or the blowing up of a federal building. Judges work in federal buildings. No judge is going to be neutral on that. What they have to do is be neutral about the case and to say, I am going to have an open mind on this. And this is a question that the judges have to ask themselves, but we also ask jurors when we have a case like this. We know that you're not going to feel neutral about 9/11, but are you going to be able to look at the evidence and decide the case on the evidence? And I think that's the same thing in terms of a dictatorship, where you're trying the former dictator, but it's a little more intense, I think, in this situation. But another thing you have to think about when we say compared to what, the level of political interference with the Saddam trial was obviously nothing compared to the level of interference previously in Iraq, but also compared to its neighbors, compared to peers. As many problems as we had, it was still a step in the right direction. I want to make it clear. I recognize the shortcomings of this, and I recognize the shortcomings of international tribunals. And I'm not really creating an equivalency between them either. But I want to be clear about what didn't go well, but also about some of the achievements that may have happened as a result of the trial.
Okay, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about how we got to this place in regards to Saddam's trial before we go any further. First, of course, when Saddam was brought in front of the court, it was pretty apparent he had done or directed some terrible things, particularly against the Kurds in the north, the Sunnis, and the Yazidi in his country and his neighboring countries. However, when he first came to power, many people saw him as a secular reformer who nationalized the oil industry, made education free to access, and created other social reforms. He was even viewed positively enough in the West that France became one of its largest suppliers of weapons in the 1980s, and the US, Great Britain, and West Germany all supported Saddam in his war against Iran. The relationship with the US ran so deep that President Reagan remained quiet in 1982 when Saddam used chemical weapons against the Kurds, and the US even blamed Iran initially for the attack. This becomes important later as this attack became the basis for one of his trials in 2005-2006. However, as time went on, over the course of 30 years, Saddam dove deeper and deeper into the authoritarian playbook, committing atrocities across the country, empowering secret police, and making decisions based on incomplete data that only painted a rosy picture of Iraq's place in the world. From the gassing of civilians in Halabja, to the full-scale targeting of Kurds in the Anfal campaign, and the mass execution of the Dujal massacre in the wake of an assassination attempt in that town, the list of atrocities committed, directed, or overseen by Saddam was long.
During the Anfal campaign, Saddam destroyed every town down to grade. So when you walked through it, it was like you were walking through, it was less than ancient ruins. You could see where the road was, and you could see where some buildings were. It was made clear to me when I went to one village where the mosque was still standing. And I asked some of the guys that were with me, why everything's flattened? Why is this still here? Well, it turned out that it had been sponsored by a family in Baghdad, and they had gone to Saddam and said, hey, when you destroy this town, can you please not destroy the mosque? Just to understand what happened during the Anfal, they killed everybody, but then they flattened with bulldozers. They salted the wells. They took down the electrical poles. They just flattened everything. And so Saddam destroyed a lot of mosques when he was doing that. Now, most of the people, for example, in the Anfal, they would take all the men away, and most of them were just killed. But he'd keep a few of them alive. and they would get beaten every day. And then he'd let them go back home in like 10 years, 15 years, or whatever. And he wouldn't tell anybody where any of these people were. And that's the crime of enforced disappearance. And it's just the most insidious kind of crime, because now none of the women back home can get remarried because their husband might be alive. Everyone who survived thinks, my husband's getting tortured every single day in prison. It's just awful. And so that was one of the things that they did.
Over the course of his 30-year reign, it is believed that Saddam's regime killed upwards of 500,000 people and disappeared, tortured, and otherwise silenced millions more. There were over 250 mass graves identified as coming from the Saddam era, and no one will ever identify everyone's remains. So we have established that this regime committed some terrible crimes. However, one of the most important lessons to learn from this experience, for those looking to hold others accountable, is the need to ensure a free and fair trial. This can be one of the hardest things to pull off, although perhaps the only harder thing is also ensuring that people perceive it as free and fair. Because if the public narrative becomes, this is just a show trial for victor's justice, you cannot achieve any of the intended goals. So, jumping ahead to after the fall of Saddam and his capture in a spider hole in Tikrit a few years later, Chris knew he wanted to play a role in the trial as things began to ramp up. So for anyone who looks at the world and says, I can't do anything about this, I present you Chris's story of how he came to be one of the leads moving the case forward in the prosecution of one of the world's worst dictators and war criminals.
I had studied human rights with Father Drinan, the former congressman who was a big proponent of human rights. And I always wanted to do something with that. But my career had been mostly state and local government. I worked for the Attorney General's office. I was governor's legal counsel. I was a member of the New Hampshire House. But I'd also done federal things. I worked for an associate independent counsel investigating a cabinet member during the Clinton administration that was the head of the Department of Interior. And I had worked on the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs briefly. But when Iraq started, all the 18-year-olds were going over, and I thought, well, what can I do? I had a commitment from the Kennedy School to do 2 years of state and local government service. And when that ended, and I knew that Saddam had been caught, I knew there was going to be a trial of Saddam, and I wanted to get involved in it. And I talked to the guy who had been appointed as the Regime Crimes Liaison. And the Regime Crimes Liaison was the person at the U.S. Embassy. They basically ran a section at the U.S. Embassy that worked with the Iraqis and the American government on anything having to do with war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the top level, the deck of cards level members of the Saddam regime. And so that involved helping build the courthouse, helping train judges and investigators, helping investigate. We had a forensics unit doing mass graves, evidence gathering, and that person was going to run it. And so I had called them and they talked to me and they said, well, I probably don't need 10 guys with your experience, but I think it would be good if you could come. They decided not to give him the job in the end. He had made some speech or something. And so I asked the people at the Justice Department, how can I get involved in this? And they said, just get over there and then, you can move over to the Regime Crimes Liaison's office. I went over there and in 2003, when I was thinking about this, things were pretty permissive. When I first got to Iraq in 2004, you could go to a chicken place and get chicken, and you had an unarmored SUV. I had worked with the Police Standards and Training Council in New Hampshire, and I had been certified as a police ethics trainer. But there was this job that they wanted certified police trainers. And of course, they were expecting to have people who had a police background. We provided our own security. Originally, we had to have a handgun on everybody and a long gun in each vehicle. But later, everybody had to have a long gun. Every vehicle had to be armored. And I was moving around Baghdad for a couple hours a day during 2004 when the Mahdi Army uprising happened and when Fallujah and Ramadi were going on. It was pretty intense. You would drive by and a bomb would go off right after you went by. The Iranians helped the insurgents figure out how to do the timing a little bit better later. But at that time, they would miss a lot and get shot at. And, it wasn't fun. But it gave me 6 months of experience working around Baghdad during this rough time. And so when I finally got a job at the Regime Crimes Liaison's office, I would have been happy just to be in a basement looking at documents with a translator or something. But the FBI wasn't willing to go up north to start the Anfal investigation. They had some bureaucratic things. And there was a Marine Corps major who had been doing mass grave investigations. And he, unbeknownst to me, went to the higher ups and said, Chris and I will just go. We'll just grab a squad of Peshmerga. We'll go up there and we'll start the investigation. And so it turns out that that 6 months was worth something to me because I ended up having operational experience, and the Marine Corps major could credibly say, Chris and I have been out there. We'll just go up there and we'll get the squad of Peshmerga, which is what we did. And then eventually the FBI came and Blackwater came to protect the group. But originally we had gone up. But that gave me the opportunity to investigate some of Saddam's worst crimes. So the chemical weapons attack in Halabja during the Iran-Iraq War, which wasn't really part of this Anfal campaign, it's kind of connected with it. And then the Anfal campaign in the late 80s, where Saddam basically made all of the Kurdish region of Iraq a free fire zone. And anybody who remained in any village was considered a criminal, no matter what their age was. So if they were part of one of the Kurdish groups, they were called agents of Iran. And if they were part of the other one, they were called saboteurs. And so Saddam said all of the agents of Iran and saboteurs should be killed. And it didn't matter whether they were a baby or an 80-year-old woman. They used chemical weapons. What we found out is that they used the chemical weapons to get the people to leave the villages and run down into these spots where they could then round them up and bring them to a processing center and then basically take them out to these mass graves and kill them. That was the investigation that we did. I lived in Sulaymaniyah for a number of months, and I worked with Iraqi investigative judges, and we would go to villages, and we had certain documents that we had obtained in the mass graves. We would go into the villages and look up the information about the people that we had found, and then we would talk to families of the victims. It wasn't happy work. It was very intense work. And it gets to one of the things that you talked about earlier, which is, does this deter? And when you work in atrocity prevention or in international criminal justice, that's a question you have to ask yourself a lot, because it's not easy. And you're leaving a lot of yourself out there when you do it. And you want to feel like it makes a difference.
Now, I'm not saying, or even suggesting, that everyone should hop on the next plane to your conflict zone of choice, but it is instructive that there are ways you can get involved with amazing and important work by putting yourself out there, connecting with communities, and offering your skills, whatever they may be, to solving problems. Okay, so back to the overall story. As the criminal case against Saddam and his leadership teams are being built, the trials begin to take shape on two major issues: the Dujal case and the Anfal case. This becomes a bit of an intriguing twist in the story here, because in Iraqi law there are some things to be aware of that truly impacted the course of the story. The biggest issue being that once a death sentence is upheld by the appeals court, the execution must take place within 30 days. So, it is fair to ask, why did the Iraqis start with a case that ended in the death of 148 people, rather than start with the bigger case of genocide?
Originally, I think that the Americans that were there at the beginning working on this, they thought that this would be done in an American kind of way, which is you start with the lower down people and you work your way up. But it turned out that under Iraqi law, when you bring a case about a particular event, you got to bring everybody and you got to do it. So we had started the Al Dajjal investigation early. Judge Rod Dewey, who was really the best investigative judge and understood how to investigate a case, how to give people due process, he had been in charge of the Al Dajjal case. And so we had a good record in Al Dajjal. It involved some of the key players like Saddam. So it was the right case to start with. And that was a case from southern Iraq where Saddam had gone to a town, Al Dajjal, and he had been ambushed on the way out of the town. And so they retaliated against the people in the town and slaughtered them, and it was an atrocity. And there was a lot of good documentation about it, partly because the Iraqi military and the security services documented what they did there. And so we were able to talk to witnesses, and we were able to develop a record that would stand up. So that was the first trial that we did. We spent a lot of time trying to get the Iraqi High Tribunal up to speed, be ready. But at some point, we just had to start. There was a lot of talk in Iraq that we were making a deal with Saddam and that he was going to come back, which made it very hard for anybody to work with us. And the Iraqi parliamentarians were getting anxious for it to happen, and we had enough evidence to do the Al Dajjal case.
So, this brings us back to the important point of ensuring a free and fair process, along with ensuring the appearance of a free and fair process. One of the big challenges in this case was the attempts by many politicians and other leaders to put their fingerprints on the case and influence things in one way or another. This is especially damaging as countries try to unite behind the new government, yet one side or another feels the deck is being stacked against them. And if the deck can be stacked against someone who once held as much power as Saddam, then what chance does the everyday citizen have?
There was an incident, several incidents actually, with respect to the tribunal where the government wanted to get rid of all of the judges that had anything to do with the Ba'ath Party. And to some extent they succeeded, but we tried to act as a brake on that because it just wouldn't be seen as fair if everybody who was a judge in the case was on one side, one religion, or let's say the Shia and the Kurds, who are Sunnis mostly, the Faili Kurds are Shia. But that just wouldn't seem fair, and it wouldn't be fair. So I think we put our finger on the scale a little bit on that, but it was a huge challenge. I mean, it was moving up to the trial that summer before the trial and at the beginning of the trial, that was one of our biggest challenges.
On top of this, as the trial continues, a war is raging throughout the country, and people associated with the case are being assassinated. Many of the defense lawyers were killed in the lead up to the trial, which led to a new challenge of trying to show the country how a free and fair trial process should work.
It's hard to find someone who's impartial coming out of a dictatorship. So we had other challenges as well, which is we were investigating and trying a case while a war was still going on, which created a lot of challenges. A lot of professionals were being killed on a regular basis in Iraq, but in particular, defense counsel, in our case, were targeted. We offered them place to live and security within the green zone, but they thought that would make them look like they were cooperating with the Americans, and they, for the most part, refused it. And of course, people on the investigative and the prosecutor and the judicial side were also killed during this process. So that's a huge challenge.
Another interesting challenge in bringing dictators to justice is the fear that holding a trial gives the person a platform to rally their supporters, send messages to those who might plan a rescue attempt, and to overall cause further problems for the country they once ruled.
At the beginning of each day, he would complain about this, that, and the other thing. And a lot of times he was trying to send messages to his people. One day he described, they took me here, they took me to the basement, they take me up through this elevator, I'm in this building, etc. And the funny thing about that was the press were upset with us because we told them they couldn't say where the courthouse was. And in fact, leading up to the trial, we called it the Agricultural Records Building. It was interesting when the auditors were asking me, why are you spending all this money on the Agricultural Records Building? And so we told the press, you know where it is, you're going to be here, but we don't want you to say where it is. And they say, yeah, but people know. And the thing is about keeping secrets is, even if people know, if you just keep saying it, there's no doubt in their minds, and you want to leave a little bit of doubt. So the funny thing about it is, Saddam came in, he said all those things, and Judge Rod Dewey, he was an investigative judge, was a censor. He got to press a button if some information was being said that couldn't be said. And so while Saddam was making this complaint, he pressed the button. And the press came to me afterwards and said, why are you censoring him when he's complaining about the Americans? And I said, well, this is an interesting illustration of 2 points. One, he was trying to describe how he gets to the courthouse and where he stays and how he comes up so that somebody might be able to rescue him. And so that's why the judge pressed the button. But also, he got it wrong. He said where he was and he wasn't there. So the next time he was in court, he got up and he started yelling. He said, oh, by the way, last time I said I was in this building, but really I'm in this other building. And you saw during the trial that he would, during the first 5 minutes, he'd get up and he'd scream and yell and rant and stuff. And that's what would get covered on TV. It made great pictures and everything. But he was pretty docile after the beginning. And at one point he said to one of my staffers, he says, tell Mr. Chris that, I'm just going to do it for the first few minutes, but then I'll behave myself.
Okay, so throughout the trial, Saddam puts on his show, the evidence is presented, and several issues pop up throughout that led to criticism of the process. At one point, a judge stops Saddam's testimony to tell him that he was not a dictator, but the people around him made him a dictator. Also, as Chris pointed out, several people working on Saddam's defense were murdered, which further brought questions about the fairness of the trial. Judges were replaced, emotions ran high, accusations flew, and in the end, a guilty verdict with a mandatory death sentence was reached. It was appealed and the sentence was confirmed, which started the aforementioned 30-day clock to carry out the sentence. This caused the charges against Saddam to be dropped in the Anfal case, but the 6 other defendants saw the conclusion of that case. There's one final lesson to be learned from this, and that is, if you're going to put someone to death, the way in which Saddam was hanged is not the way you do it.
Obviously, the way that the hanging done was a fiasco, and it colored people's view of the whole process in a very negative way. It was predictable that if cameras were allowed in and people other than the officials that were involved in the execution and had to be there were there, that something like this might happen. We had, in the lead up to the trial, had a lot of trouble where important Iraqis said, I want to be there on this day and this, that, or the other thing. Now, I wasn't there when the hanging happened. And I know there's lots of things that happened when I was there that from the outside you'd say, oh my God, why didn't this guy do it right? And I know that I worked very hard on it and I knew what the problem was. And sometimes things happen. So I don't know what happened, but I know that the situation had changed a little bit in terms of the U.S. government's willingness to stick their finger on the scale or interfere too much. However, we have the right to not turn over physical custody of someone if we think that they're going to be mistreated. And we had physical custody of Saddam up until the hanging. And so what should have happened, and for all I know, the people that were there then did everything they possibly could to make this happen. But what should have happened is we should have controlled access to that facility. We should have taken away cell phones, just like we did in the trial. And we should have restricted who was there. And if they said no, then the president would call up the prime minister and say, well, then we're not doing it. So I don't know what happened, but what happened was bad. I don't know what to say about it, except for I wish that hadn't happened. And when it did happen, I thought 2 years of my life and all of this horrible circumstances, and now this. And if it hadn't happened like that, there would still be criticisms of the trial, and the trial is susceptible to criticism. But I still felt like there were things that were better about doing it in Iraq than doing it internationally.
Unsurprisingly, you want to ensure you control the message, you want to ensure that these things are done with dignity and respect, even when the dictator did not show that same respect to people's lives that they destroyed. You want these things to happen so that you can show a positive path forward for a country and not turn people into martyrs to inspire their followers to continue the fight against the new government. While it may be very difficult to achieve, there can be positives to come out of these experiences.
I never thought this would be the thing that I thought was one of the most positive parts of the trial, was people seeing what a trial is supposed to look like, a real trial is supposed to look like, and saying, hey, we have a real country, we have real trials. And I was very surprised on the day after the trial how many Iraqis came up to me just crying and proud of the fact that they were having this trial. Or the victims who I talked to who got a chance. I mean, there was in the Anfal case, there was an old man who I had dealt with quite a bit during the investigation, and he got to testify and he got to say to Saddam, why did you do this? Why did you kill my family?
The takeaway for me in this is that we can make a difference in the world, and while it may take time, the truth can come out to make the world a better place. As I look around the world to see the horrors of war, civil conflict, famine, and atrocities, I'm glad to see that there are many great people continuing to do the difficult work of documenting atrocities, bringing light to these issues, and laying the groundwork to one day hold people accountable. Even if they escape justice in life, history can hold these terrible dictators to account for what they have done if we continue the work of uncovering the truth. For Chris, he takes solace in the fact that this work does instill some deterrence through the setting of international norms.
There was hope. And sometimes with the atrocity stuff, you're seeing the worst of mankind, and it's hard to be hopeful. Now, there were some signs that the deterrence effect actually works. So, for example, when Saddam's people would talk about using chemical weapons, they would never say chemical weapons. And they understood that they were being watched, And nowadays, we have the ability to really, with overhead assets, et cetera, to really watch people. And I think it's going to be harder for established countries to do some of this stuff. It still happens, of course. It's hard to deal with a group like ISIS that's a terrorist group that's fanatical. But, the Syrian regime committed a bunch of atrocities. It still goes on. And so the question is, why do we keep doing this? Well, why do we prosecute murderers? We're not going to end murder, but we're bringing justice to the victims. We're documenting what happened, and hopefully we're deterring some of it in the future.
Thank you for taking a listen to today's episode. While it can be difficult to engage in a world that seems so chaotic and out of control, I hope this conversation helps you see a bit of a brighter future and to appreciate the amazing work that people are doing every day around the world to make the world a better place. Whether you are a bright-eyed young lawyer in New Hampshire, a local journalist documenting a war from your hometown, a retiree with a passion for research, or someone brave enough to use your own voice to shape the global conversation, I appreciate all of the things you do, both big and small, to make the world a better place. Even the small act of educating yourself about critical global issues can be the spark that initiates the global butterfly effect, sending ripples around the world. This has been The Global in the Granite State, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. As always, I am Tim Horgan, your host, producer, director, audio engineer, researcher, fact-checker, and overall designer of this program. Our theme music continues to be admin by A.A. Alto, and our interlude music is Heroes Among Us by White Records. Till next time.